The dust swirled across the parched Wyoming landscape as Beatrice Harper clutched her torn shawl tighter around her bony shoulders, each step more agonizing than the last. The year was 1878, and the West had proven to be far crueler than the romantic tales circulating back east had led her to believe. 3 days without food had left her lightheaded, her once vibrant blue eyes now sunken in a face weathered beyond her 22 years. Beatrice had been walking since dawn, following the rutted wagon trail that promised to lead to civilization, or at the very least, a ranch where she might find some mercy. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as a modest homestead appeared on the horizon. A simple 2-story wooden house stood surrounded by a barn, corral, and various outbuildings humble but well-maintained. Smoke curled from the chimney, signaling life and perhaps hope. Her pace quickened despite her exhaustion. A man was working in the corral, his broad shoulders and strong arms visible as he repaired a section of fence. He hadn't noticed her yet, and Beatrice hesitated at the edge of the property, summoning what little courage remained in her depleted body. The man turned suddenly, sensing her presence. He was tall, with a weather-beaten face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes sharp and cautious as they studied the bedraggled woman approaching his land. "Sir," Beatrice called out, her voice cracking from thirst, "I do not mean to intrude." The cowboy set down his tools and approached the fence, one hand instinctively resting on the pistol at his hip. "Madam," he acknowledged with a nod, his expression guarded but not unkind. As Beatrice drew closer, she saw he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes the color of the Wyoming sky after a storm, and a strong jawline softened by several days' worth of stubble. "I'm looking for work," she managed, straightening her posture despite the weakness in her limbs. Her pride was one of the few possessions she had left, any work at all. The man's eyes traveled over her tattered dress, the worn-out boots, and the small bundle she carried. "Don't have much need for help right now," he said, though his tone had softened. Desperation surged through Beatrice. "I'll work for food," she whispered, the words burning her throat with shame. Something changed in the cowboy's expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a deeper struggle. He removed his hat, revealing thick chestnut hair, and studied her more carefully. "What's your name, miss?" he asked. "Beatrice Harper," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Clayton West," he responded. "This is the West Creek Ranch." He paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision. "You'll stay as my wife if you say yes," he stated suddenly, his voice firm but uncertain, as if the words had surprised even him. Beatrice felt the world tilt beneath her feet. I beg your pardon," Clayton cleared his throat, his cheeks coloring slightly beneath his tan. "That came out wrong. What I meant was, I need a wife, not a worker. The ranch needs a woman's touch, and He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with his own proposal. "Sir, I don't even know you," Beatrice whispered, alarmed yet strangely intrigued by the unexpected offer. Clayton rubbed the back of his neck. "I know how it sounds, but I'm offering you protection, food, shelter, a life, not what you're thinking." He gestured toward the house. "You'd have your own room, your own space. I wouldn't expect, that is, not until we know each other better, if ever." Beatrice's mind raced. The proposition was shocking, improper, and yet what choice did she have? The alternative was starvation or worse. "Why would you offer marriage to a stranger?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Clayton's gaze drifted to the distant mountains. "Been alone too long, I reckon." "Ranch needs a woman's hand. Town's 20 miles away, and the nearest unmarried woman is the blacksmith's daughter. She's 14. He shrugged. "I'm not getting any younger, and neither is this place." Before Beatrice could respond, her knees buckled. Clayton vaulted over the fence with surprising agility and caught her before she hit the ground. "Let's get you inside first," he said, his voice gentle as he lifted her into his arms. Food and rest, then decisions. The inside of the ranch house was unexpectedly neat if sparse. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall. Simple furniture, a table with 4 chairs, a sofa covered in a woolen blanket, and a rocking chair filled the space. Stairs led to what Beatrice assumed were bedrooms above. Clayton set her down carefully on the sofa. "When did you last eat?" he asked, moving to the kitchen area. Properly. 3 days ago, Beatrice admitted. I had some berries yesterday morning. Clayton's mouth tightened into a grim line as he ladled stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a bowl. Small bites, he cautioned as he handed it to her. Too much too fast will make you sick. Beatrice nodded, fighting the urge to gulp down the savory meal. Each small spoonful was heaven, the rich broth and chunks of venison bringing strength back to her limbs. As she ate, Clayton poured her a cup of water and sat in the chair opposite, watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Where are you from? He asked. Between careful bites, Beatrice told him about Philadelphia, about her parents' death from influenza the previous year, about the cousin who had promised her a teaching position in Denver, only to abandon her at a way station with nothing but her small trunk of possessions. I was robbed 2 weeks ago, she explained. Everything except what I'm wearing and a few items in my bundle. Clayton listened without interruption, his expression darkening at the mention of the robbery. Lot of desperate men out here, he said finally, and some just plain bad. And which are you, Mr. West? Beatrice asked, setting down her empty bowl. Desperate or bad, a ghost of a smile crossed his face. Neither, I hope, just lonely. He stood, taking her bowl. There's a room upstairs with a bed, clean linens, you can wash up and rest. We'll talk more tomorrow when you're stronger. And your proposal, Beatrice pressed, needing clarity despite her exhaustion. Clayton paused. Still stands, but I won't hold you to any answer given while you're half-starved and exhausted. A night's rest might have you seeing things differently. He nodded toward the stairs. First door on the right, there's a basin and water for washing. I'll be out in the barn if you need anything. As Beatrice climbed the stairs, her legs still shaky, she wondered what kind of man made such an offer to a stranger. Was it kindness, desperation, or something more sinister? The room, when she entered it, gave her pause. It was simple but clean, with a 4-poster bed covered in a handmade quilt, a small dresser with a mirror, and a rocking chair by the window. Fresh towels and a pitcher of water sat on a washstand, and a bar of soap smelling faintly of lavender waited beside them. This was not the room of a man expecting a dalliance with a desperate woman. It was a room prepared for someone expected to stay. After washing the dust from her face and hands, Beatrice laid down on the bed, intending only to rest for a moment before further investigating her surroundings. Instead, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she awoke, moonlight was streaming through the window. For a moment, panic seized her as she tried to remember where she was. Then the events of the day came rushing back. She rose, feeling steadier than before, and moved to the window. Below, in the silver light of a nearly full moon, Clayton was crossing from the barn to the house, his stride purposeful but unhurried. There was something about his solitary figure moving through the moonlight that touched her, a man alone in this vast country, tending his land and livestock with no one to share either his burdens or his triumphs. Beatrice moved away from the window before he could look up and see her watching. She found a lamp on the dresser and lit it, illuminating the room fully. Opening the drawers, she discovered they were empty except for a single item in the top drawer, a small, leather-bound Bible. She opened it to find an inscription, "To my son Clayton on his confirmation. May God's word light your path. Love, Mother." The simple inscription humanized the stranger who had taken her in. He had a mother who loved him, a faith that perhaps guided him. It didn't guarantee his character, but it suggested he came from people who valued morality. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Miss Harper, I heard movement. Are you awake?" "Yes, Mr. West. Just a moment." Beatrice smoothed her rumpled dress as best she could and opened the door. Clayton stood in the hallway, a respectful distance from the threshold. "I've made some supper if you're feeling up to eating more. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread." "That sounds wonderful. Thank you." Beatrice followed him downstairs, noting how carefully he kept space between them, as if to reassure her of his honorable intentions. The kitchen table was set with simple earthenware dishes, the food already laid out. Clayton pulled out a chair for her before taking his own seat across the table. He bowed his head briefly in silent prayer before serving her a portion of beans and a square of cornbread. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook," he said, a hint of apology in his voice. It looks delicious, Beatrice assured him, and found she wasn't merely being polite. The simple food smelled wonderful to her still hungry body. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Clayton spoke again. "I've been thinking about what I said earlier," he began, setting down his fork. "It wasn't right to put you in such a position, especially when you were in need. I apologize." Beatrice studied him, surprised by his candor. "Yet you haven't withdrawn the offer," she observed. "No," he admitted. "I haven't, but I want to be clear about what I'm proposing." He met her gaze steadily. "This ranch needs a woman's touch, and I need a partner. Someone to share the work, the decisions, maybe someday." He cleared his throat. "But I'm not asking for anything improper. We would be husband and wife in name at first. The rest would come with time if it comes at all. You would marry a woman you don't love." Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. Clayton considered this. "My parents had an arranged marriage. They grew to love each other deeply over time. I watched it happen." He shrugged. "Love can grow from respect and partnership. I'm not looking for passion, Miss Harper. I'm looking for a companion who might someday become more." Beatrice found his honesty refreshing, if unconventional. "And if I say no, then I'll take you to town tomorrow. Give you enough money for a room at the boarding house and a meal or two while you look for proper work." He smiled slightly. "I'm not in the habit of leaving women to starve on the prairie." His answer reassured her. There was no threat in his offer, no coercion, just an unusual proposition from a man who seemed as straightforward as the land he worked. "May I ask what happened to your family?" She ventured. A shadow crossed Clayton's face. "Parents died 5 years ago. Fever. My brother Caleb moved to California after that. This place was too full of ghosts for him." He gestured around the room. "Been on my own since then. No one else, no friends or neighbors." "Neighbors, yes, but the nearest is 10 miles away. Friends in town, not the same as family, though." He rose, collecting their empty plates. "You should know what you'd be getting into. The work is hard. Winters are brutal. Town's far, so you'd be alone with me most days. Church is only twice a month when the traveling preacher comes through." Beatrice helped him clear the table, thinking as she did so. The situation was far from ideal, but there was something compelling about Clayton West. He was honest, direct, and seemed genuinely decent. And what were her alternatives? A precarious existence in a frontier town where a single woman with no connections was vulnerable to all manner of danger. "I need time to think," she said finally. Clayton nodded. "Of course, take all the time you need." He gestured to a bookshelf in the corner. "There are books if you'd like to read. I need to check on a mare that's close to foaling." After he left, Beatrice explored the main floor of the house more thoroughly. The bookshelves held a surprising variety of volumes, practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry, but also novels by Dickens and Twain, poetry collections, and several books on history. Clayton West was clearly a more educated man than his rough exterior suggested. A small desk in the corner contained papers related to the ranch ledgers showing cattle sales, supply purchases, and other business matters. The figures told a story of a modestly successful operation, neither wealthy nor struggling. On the mantel were a few photographs an older couple Beatrice assumed were Clayton's parents, a younger version of Clayton with another young man who must have been his brother, and a formal portrait of a dark-haired woman whose relation to the family wasn't clear. Beatrice was studying this last photograph when Clayton returned. "My sister-in-law," he explained, noticing her interest. "Caleb's wife, they have 2 children now. Do you see them often?" "Haven't seen them since they left." There was a note of something regret, perhaps, in his voice. "We write, though, not as often as we should." Beatrice replaced the photograph carefully. "Mr. West, Clayton," he corrected. "If you're considering becoming my wife, you might as well use my given name." "Clayton," she amended. "I believe I will accept your proposal." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're certain? It's a big decision to make so quickly." "I'm not certain of anything," Beatrice admitted, "but I believe you're an honorable man. The alternative is to struggle alone in a town where I know no one, with no guarantee of finding decent work." She squared her shoulders. "At least here I would have purpose, security." Clayton studied her face as if searching for any sign of hesitation. "I can't offer you luxury or an easy life," he warned. "I'm not looking for luxury," Beatrice replied. just a chance to build something worthwhile. A slow smile spread across Clayton's face, transforming his serious countenance. Then we have an agreement, Miss Harper. Beatrice, she corrected, returning his smile tentatively. Beatrice, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. We'll ride to town tomorrow to see the preacher and make arrangements. For tonight, your room is yours alone. With that promise, they bid each other good night, Beatrice returning to her room with a strange mixture of trepidation and hope. She had just agreed to marry a man she'd met mere hours ago, a decision that would have scandalized everyone she knew in Philadelphia. Yet something about Clayton West inspired trust. Perhaps it was his straightforward manner or the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. Whatever it was, Beatrice found herself looking forward to learning more about the man who would soon be her husband. Morning came with the sounds of a working ranch roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, and the rhythmic chopping of wood. Beatrice dressed quickly in her worn clothing, wishing she had something more presentable for a trip to town. When she descended the stairs, she found Clayton setting out a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "You cook quite well for a bachelor," she observed, taking a seat at the table. Clayton shrugged. Necessity teaches many skills, not all of them mastered, mind you. He poured her a cup of coffee. "I set aside some money for you to buy fabric and whatever else you might need in town, a wedding gift, if you will." Beatrice felt a flush of gratitude and embarrassment. "That's very generous. It's practical," Clayton countered, though his eyes were kind. "A rancher's wife needs proper clothing for the work and the weather." He hesitated. "There's something else we should discuss before we go to town." "Yes, people will talk. A stranger showing up and marrying within days, they'll assume certain things." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "That I'm in a delicate condition," Clayton nodded. "Or that I found you in a brothel or some other such nonsense. Small towns breed big gossip. Does it matter what they think?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious about his concern. "To me, no." Clayton took a sip of his coffee. "But it might to you, especially if we stay here long term." His consideration touched her. "I appreciate your concern," Beatrice said carefully. "But I've learned that people will talk regardless of what we do. The truth is between us and God." Something like respect flickered in Clayton's eyes. "Well said." He rose from the table. "I'll hitch the wagon while you finish breakfast. We've got a 2-hour ride ahead of us." The journey to town gave Beatrice her first real look at Clayton's land. West Creek Ranch spread across several hundred acres of rolling prairie, with a creek meandering through its heart. Cattle grazed in the distance, and horses ran in a far pasture. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, very different from the manicured parks and gardens of Philadelphia. "How long have you had this land?" she asked, as they followed the rutted wagon trail. "My father claimed it in '58, right after he married my mother," Clayton explained, handling the team of horses with easy confidence. "I was born here in '61, right as the war was starting back east." "You've never lived anywhere else?" Clayton shook his head. "Traveled some as a young man. Denver, Salt Lake City, even made it to San Francisco once, but this land gets in your blood." He glanced at her. "What about you? Have you always lived in Philadelphia?" Beatrice told him about growing up in the city, about her father's modest success as a clerk in a shipping company, about her mother's determination that her daughter receive an education. "I taught at girls' school for 2 years before my parents fell ill," she explained. "After they died, the house had to be sold to pay debts. My cousin's offer seemed providential at the time." Clayton's jaw tightened. "This cousin, what's his name?" "Benjamin Harper." "Why?" "Just wondering if he ever passes through these parts," Clayton said, his voice deceptively casual. "I'd like to have a word with him about abandoning a young woman in dangerous territory." The protective sentiment, unexpected from a man she barely knew, warmed Beatrice despite the cool morning air. "I doubt our paths will cross again," she said, "and I've learned a valuable lesson about trust." "Not all lessons need to be so harsh," Clayton remarked, "but I hope you don't apply it too broadly." "You mean by marrying a stranger?" Beatrice asked, a hint of wry humor in her voice. Clayton laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Exactly that." The town of Pine Creek came into view as they crested a hill, a single main street lined with wooden buildings. some with false fronts trying to appear grander than they were. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and horses were hitched outside what appeared to be a general store. "It's smaller than I expected," Beatrice observed. "But growing," Clayton noted. "There was talk of the railroad coming through, but it went 20 miles south instead. Still, we get by." He guided the wagon to a hitching post outside the general store. "Mrs. Abernathy runs this place," he explained as he helped Beatrice down from the wagon. "Fairest prices in the county, and she knows everyone's business. If the preacher's in town, she'll know." The bell above the door jingled as they entered. The store was larger inside than it appeared from the street, with shelves stocked with everything from food to fabric to farming implements. A plump woman with graying hair looked up from behind the counter, her face breaking into a smile of recognition. Clayton West, twice in 1 month. "The world must be ending," she teased, her eyes quickly moving to Beatrice with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Abernathy," Clayton greeted her, removing his hat. "This is Miss Beatrice Harper. We're looking for Preacher Miller. Is he in town?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "He is indeed, staying at the Widow Jenkins boarding house." Her gaze flicked between them. "Might I ask why you're seeking the preacher on such a fine Tuesday morning?" Clayton's hand moved to rest lightly on Beatrice's back, not possessive, but supportive. "Miss Harper has done me the honor of agreeing to be my wife. We're hoping to be married today if the preacher is available." The storekeeper's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise before she recovered herself. "Well, this is news indeed." She bustled around the counter to take Beatrice's hands in her own. "My dear, what a blessing for our Clayton. He's been alone far too long." Beatrice managed a smile, conscious of the woman's scrutiny. "It's a blessing for me as well, Mrs. Abernathy." "You'll need a dress," the woman declared, already moving toward the fabric section. "I have some lovely cotton prints that just came in, and you'll want proper linens for the house, of course." As Mrs. Abernathy pulled bolts of fabric from the shelves, chattering about wedding preparations, Beatrice caught Clayton's eye. He gave her a small, apologetic smile and a slight shrug that seemed to say, "This is how it begins." An hour later, laden with packages containing fabric, basic sewing supplies, and other necessities Mrs. Abernathy had insisted were essential for a new bride, they made their way to the boarding house. Preacher Miller, a thin man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, listened to their request with more curiosity than judgment. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," he said after Clayton had explained their situation in carefully edited terms, "not to be entered into lightly." "We understand that, preacher," Clayton replied. "We're both of age and sound mind, entering this union freely." The preacher turned to Beatrice. "And you, Miss Harper, you're certain this is what you want?" Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I am, sir, Mr. West has offered me a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. I believe that's a solid foundation for marriage." Preacher Miller studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. I can perform the ceremony this afternoon at the church, 2 o'clock. As they left the boarding house, Clayton turned to Beatrice. "There's time before the ceremony if you'd like to have a dress made. Mrs. Peterson is a fine seamstress." Beatrice hesitated. "Would that be possible in such a short time? For a wedding, she'll make it happen." Clayton smiled. "Every woman deserves a special dress for her wedding day, even if the circumstances are unusual." Mrs. Peterson, a sharp-eyed woman with nimble fingers, clucked and fussed over Beatrice, taking measurements and offering opinions on which fabric would best suit her coloring. With surprising efficiency, she began cutting and pinning a simple but elegant dress of sky blue cotton. "Blue for fidelity," the seamstress remarked as she worked, "and it matches your eyes perfectly, dear." While Beatrice stood for her fitting, Clayton excused himself to attend to other errands. "I'll meet you at the church," he promised before departing. Left alone with Mrs. Peterson, Beatrice braced herself for the inevitable questions. "So," the seamstress began, pins held between her lips, "how did you and Clayton meet?" Beatrice had prepared for this. "I was traveling west to take a teaching position," she said, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "We met on the road, and sometimes you just know when something is right." Mrs. Peterson smiled knowingly. Clayton West is a good man, keeps to himself but honest as the day is long. You could do worse for a husband in these parts. I believe you're right, Beatrice agreed, surprised by how genuinely she meant it. By the time the clock struck 2, Beatrice stood outside the small white church in her new blue dress, her hair arranged as neatly as possible without proper pins or combs. Clayton appeared around the corner, and for a moment, he stopped in his tracks, staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He had cleaned up as well, his hair trimmed, face freshly shaved, wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers that looked as though they'd been pressed for the occasion. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he approached. "Thank you," Beatrice replied, suddenly shy. "You look very handsome yourself." Clayton offered his arm, ready to become Mrs. West. The ceremony was brief but solemn, with Mrs. Abernathy and the blacksmith serving as witnesses. Beatrice felt a curious sense of calm as she repeated the vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish a man she barely knew. When Clayton slipped a simple gold band onto her finger where he had acquired it on such short notice, she didn't know the weight of it, felt strange but not unwelcome. "By the power vested in me," Preacher Miller intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Clayton hesitated, his eyes meeting Beatrice's in silent question. She gave a small nod, and he leaned forward to place a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips. It lasted only a moment, but Beatrice felt a surprising flutter in her chest at the contact. Their witnesses applauded, and Mrs. Abernathy wiped away a tear. "Such a lovely couple," she declared. "We must have a celebration." Despite their protests, a small reception was hastily arranged at the boarding house, with word spreading quickly through the small town. By late afternoon, Beatrice had been introduced to what seemed like every resident of Pine Creek, each offering congratulations and barely concealed curiosity about the newcomer who had so suddenly become Mrs. Clayton West. Throughout it all, Clayton remained at her side, his hand occasionally resting on the small of her back, his presence steady and reassuring. He fielded questions with good-natured deflection, neither lying outright nor revealing the unusual circumstances of their union. It was past sunset when they finally began the journey back to the ranch to home. Beatrice reminded herself. The wagon was now filled with wedding gifts, a quilt from Mrs. Abernathy, preserves from the preacher's wife, a set of carved wooden spoons from the blacksmith, and other tokens of welcome from their new neighbors. "They were kinder than I expected," Beatrice admitted as the lights of the town faded behind them. "Good people mostly," Clayton agreed. "They'll be curious for a while, but eventually they'll accept you as part of the community." They traveled in companionable silence for a time, the stars emerging in the vast Wyoming sky above them. Beatrice found herself stealing glances at her new husband's profile, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken. "Having second thoughts?" Clayton asked, catching one of her looks. "Adjusting to new realities," Beatrice corrected. 24 hours ago, I was starving on the road. Now I'm a married woman returning to a ranch I've barely seen with a husband I'm just beginning to know." Clayton nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. Life can change direction faster than a prairie wind. Indeed. Beatrice pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "May I ask you something, Clayton? Anything. That ring, where did you get it on such short notice?" A shadow crossed his face. "It was my mother's. I've kept it in my desk since she passed." "Oh, I couldn't possibly. She would have wanted you to have it," Clayton interrupted gently. "She always hoped I'd find someone to share my life with." The simple statement touched Beatrice deeply. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll try to be worthy of it." When they arrived at the ranch, Clayton insisted on carrying her over the threshold for luck, he explained with a slightly embarrassed smile. Inside, the house looked different to Beatrice now. Not just a shelter, but a home she would help shape. "I'll bring in your things," Clayton said, setting her down carefully. "Make yourself comfortable." As he stepped outside to unload the wagon, Beatrice moved through the main room, touching the furniture, the books, the photographs, all now partially hers by marriage. The reality of her situation struck her anew. She was truly Mrs. Clayton West now, for better or worse. When Clayton returned with their purchases and gifts, He set them on the table and stood awkwardly in the center of the room, as if suddenly unsure of his place in his own home. "I meant what I said," he began, "about giving you time. Your room is yours alone until you decide otherwise." The consideration in his voice moved her. "Thank you," Beatrice said softly, "for everything. Not many men would be so patient." "Not many men marry strangers," Clayton pointed out with a wry smile. "We're already off the common path." That night, Beatrice lay in her marriage bed, though she occupied it alone listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. The occasional lowing of cattle, the hoot of an owl, the creak of the house settling. And below it all, the knowledge that across the hall her husband slept in his own room, honoring his promise to give her time. It was a strange beginning to a marriage, she reflected. But perhaps, in time, it could grow into something real and lasting. With that hopeful thought, she drifted into sleep, dreaming of blue skies and endless prairie. The following weeks established a rhythm to their shared life. Beatrice rose early each morning to prepare breakfast, learning Clayton's preferences: strong coffee, eggs with just a hint of pepper, bacon crisp but not burnt. After breakfast, they would discuss the day's tasks. Clayton handled the livestock and field work, while Beatrice took charge of the house, garden, and chicken coop. At first, her city-bred hands struggled with the rough work of ranch life. Blisters formed and broke, only to form calluses in their place. Her fair skin reddened in the Wyoming sun, before gradually tanning to a light golden hue. The heavy lifting and constant movement built strength in arms that had previously known only the gentle labor of teaching. Clayton was patient with her mistakes, showing her how to collect eggs without agitating the hens, how to tell when vegetables were ready for harvesting, how to preserve the summer's bounty for the winter ahead. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch if the weather allowed, or by the fire if it didn't, and talk. Those conversations became the foundation of their relationship. Clayton told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's dreams for the land, about his mother's courage in carving a home from the wilderness. Beatrice shared stories of Philadelphia, of the girls she had taught, of the books that had shaped her thinking. They discovered shared interests: a love of poetry, a curiosity about the wider world, a deep appreciation for the natural beauty surrounding them. They also uncovered differences: Clayton's pragmatic approach to problems versus Beatrice's more thoughtful analysis, his preference for solitude against her enjoyment of company. As summer ripened toward fall, Beatrice found herself watching Clayton when he wasn't aware: the confident way he handled his horse, the gentleness in his hands when treating an injured calf, the rare but transformative smile that could light his entire face. She began to understand why a man might choose this hard but rewarding life, and why he might want someone to share it with. For his part, Clayton seemed equally fascinated by her. She would catch him observing her as she hung laundry on the line or kneaded bread dough, his expression a mixture of admiration and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. They maintained separate bedrooms, though the invisible barrier between them was gradually thinning. Their hands would brush when passing dishes at meals, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Clayton began offering his hand to help her into the wagon when they traveled to town, his touch warm and strong against her skin. Small gestures, building toward something neither of them named. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clayton turned to her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Beatrice," he began, "are you content here?" She considered the question seriously. "I am," she answered truthfully. "More than I expected to be." Relief softened his features. "I've been worried you might be regretting your decision. This life is harder than what you knew before." "Harder in some ways," Beatrice acknowledged, "but also richer." She looked out at the land stretching before them, golden in the fading light. "There's a freedom here I never knew in the city, a purpose to each day's work." Clayton nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's how I've always felt about this place. Every fence post, every head of cattle, every acre of hay, it all means something. It's not just work, it's building something that will last. Something to pass on," Beatrice said quietly. A charged silence fell between them at the implication of her words, children. A future that extended beyond the two of them. Clayton's hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the porch railing. Beatrice, he said, his voice low and serious, I know our arrangement began unusually, but I want you to know that I've come to. He paused, searching for the right words. I've come to care for you, deeply. Beatrice felt her pulse quicken. I care for you too, Clayton. His eyes, so often guarded, were open now, revealing a vulnerability that touched her. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he assured her. I just wanted you to know that, for me, this marriage has become more than a practical arrangement. Without allowing herself to overthink, Beatrice leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when Clayton's arms came around her, drawing her closer, it deepened into something more urgent, more passionate. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Clayton rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he admitted. Beatrice smiled. What took you so long? His answering laugh was warm against her skin. Fear, I suppose, fear that you might still see this as only a convenient arrangement. Not anymore, Beatrice whispered, her hand coming up to touch his cheek. Not for some time now. That night, when they reached the top of the stairs where they usually parted ways to their separate rooms, Clayton paused. Good night, Beatrice, he said, his voice husky with restraint. Beatrice gathered her courage. I was thinking, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, that perhaps it's time we truly lived as husband and wife. Clayton's eyes darkened with desire, but he held himself carefully in check. Are you certain? In answer, Beatrice took his hand and led him toward his bedroom, the master bedroom she had not yet entered. Inside was a large 4-poster bed, a dresser with a mirror, and a chest at the foot of the bed. The room was plain but comfortable, with curtains that matched those in the main room downstairs. I want to be your wife in every way, Clayton, Beatrice said softly. Not because of our arrangement, but because I choose it, because I've come to love you. The admission of love hung in the air between them for a heartbeat before Clayton gathered her into his arms. And I love you, he whispered against her hair. More than I thought possible when I made that impulsive offer months ago. Their coming together that night was tender and passionate, a true consummation of a marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement, but had blossomed into something real and precious. Afterward, as Beatrice lay in the circle of Clayton's arms, listening to his steady breathing, she marveled at the strange path that had led her to this moment of contentment. What are you thinking about? Clayton murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. About how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't stopped at your ranch that day, Beatrice replied. Clayton tightened his arms around her. I don't like to think about that, he admitted. The idea of you continuing down that road alone. But I didn't, Beatrice reminded him. I stopped. You offered me work for food and then so much more. Best impulsive decision I ever made, Clayton said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Though I'm not sure Mrs. Abernathy would approve of how our marriage really began, Beatrice laughed softly. Some stories are better kept between husband and wife. As fall gave way to winter, the ranch settled into a different rhythm. The days grew shorter, the work shifting from the fields to the barn and house. Clayton spent hours repairing equipment and caring for the livestock, ensuring everything was prepared for the harsh Wyoming winter ahead. Beatrice found herself busy preserving the last of the garden's bounty, making soap and candles, and sewing warmer clothing for them both. Their first real test as a couple came in early December, when a blizzard swept across the prairie with little warning. The temperature plummeted, and snow piled high against the sides of the house. For 3 days, they were completely isolated, the world beyond their windows a swirling mass of white. Clayton spent hours in the barn, making sure the animals were safe and warm, returning to the house with ice crystals in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes. Beatrice kept the fire burning, prepared hot meals and coffee, and worried each time he ventured out into the storm. On the third night, as the wind howled around the eaves of the house, Clayton returned from his final check of the livestock looking particularly worn. We lost 2 calves, he reported grimly as he shed his snow-covered coat and boots. Found them too late. Beatrice guided him to the chair closest to the fire and brought him a steaming cup of coffee. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing how he felt each loss personally. Clayton took a long sip before replying. "It's the way of things out here. You prepare as best you can, but nature always has the final say." He caught her hand. "Thank you for keeping things going here. Having a warm house and hot food to come back to, it makes all the difference." In that moment, Beatrice understood more clearly than ever the partnership they had formed. It wasn't just about affection or physical desire, though those elements had grown stronger with each passing day. It was about facing the challenges of this harsh but beautiful land together, each contributing their strength to ensure their survival and prosperity. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to find the landscape transformed pristine white fields stretching to the horizon, trees encased in glittering ice. Snow drifted higher than the corral fences in places. The beauty was breathtaking, but so was the work that lay ahead to dig out paths to the barn and other outbuildings. Side by side they labored, Clayton breaking through the deeper drifts with a shovel, Beatrice following with a broom to clear the remaining snow. By midday, they had created passable paths to the essential areas of the ranch. "We make a good team, Mrs. West," Clayton said as they paused to catch their breath, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Indeed we do, Mr. West," Beatrice agreed, her cheeks rosy from exertion and cold. As winter settled in earnest around the ranch, their evenings grew longer. After supper, they would sit before the fire, reading aloud to each other from Clayton's collection of books or playing checkers on a board he had carved years earlier. Sometimes they would simply talk, planning improvements for the ranch when spring came, or sharing memories of their lives before they met. It was during one such evening in late January that Beatrice decided to broach a subject that had been on her mind for several weeks. "Clayton," she began, setting aside her mending, "I've been thinking about the future." He looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "What about it? About children," Beatrice said simply. "About starting a family." Clayton's hands stilled. "Are you?" "Not yet," Beatrice replied, understanding his unfinished question. "But I hope to be someday soon." A slow smile spread across Clayton's face. "I'd like that," he said softly. "Very much." The conversation opened a new dimension in their relationship. They began to discuss names they liked, to plan modifications to the house to accommodate a growing family, to dream about the legacy they might create together. Spring arrived with a burst of green across the prairie. Wild flowers dotted the landscape, and new calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the pastures. Beatrice planted an expanded garden, adding medicinal herbs and flowers to the practical vegetables they needed for sustenance. In May, 6 months after their wedding night, Beatrice confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She waited until evening when they sat together on the porch watching the sunset to share the news. "Clayton," she said, taking his hand in hers, "I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, his eyes wide with wonder. Then he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "When?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "November, I think," Beatrice replied, leaning into his embrace. Just before our first anniversary, Clayton placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming into my life, for building this future with me." As summer progressed, Beatrice's body changed with her growing child. Clayton became even more protective, insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day and taking on some of her chores despite her protests. Yet he also respected her determination to remain active and useful, understanding that idleness would be its own form of hardship for his industrious wife. They traveled to town more frequently, partly to visit the doctor who had recently established a practice there, and partly to purchase supplies for the baby. The good people of Pine Creek, having fully accepted Beatrice as one of their own, showered her with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and home remedies for everything from morning sickness to swollen ankles. Mrs. Abernathy, who had appointed herself Beatrice's unofficial mentor in all things related to frontier motherhood, was particularly enthusiastic. "Nothing brings a marriage together like a child," she declared during one of their visits, though you two seem solid enough already. Beatrice exchanged a smile with Clayton. We've been fortunate, she acknowledged. Fortunate, my foot, Mrs. Abernathy scoffed good-naturedly. You work at it, both of you. I've seen how you look at each other, how you move together. That's not luck, that's choice. Her words stayed with Beatrice long after they left town. Choice. That was what their marriage had been from the beginning, a choice made in desperate circumstances, then remade each day as they built their life together. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cooler air that came with sunset, Clayton broached a subject they had discussed only briefly before. I've been thinking about my brother, he said, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. About writing to tell him about the baby. Beatrice knew this was significant. Clayton rarely spoke of Caleb, and the few letters they exchanged each year were cordial but not deeply personal. I think that's a wonderful idea, she encouraged. He's going to be an uncle after all. Clayton nodded slowly. There's more to it than that. When our parents died, Caleb and I, we didn't handle it well. Said things we shouldn't have. He left angry and I was too proud to ask him to stay. Beatrice covered his hand with hers. It's never too late to rebuild those bridges, Clayton. Maybe not, he agreed. Having you, preparing for this child, it's made me think differently about family, about what matters. The letter was written that very night, with both of them contributing thoughts and well wishes. Clayton posted it on their next trip to town, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension as he handed it to the postmaster. As Beatrice's pregnancy progressed, Clayton insisted on hiring a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work. Just until after the baby comes, he assured her when she expressed concern about the expense. We can afford it, and I want to be able to help you more around the house. September brought the first hints of fall cooler nights, a subtle changing of colors across the landscape. Beatrice's preparations for the baby intensified. She sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, lined a drawer with padding to serve as a cradle, and read everything she could find about childbirth and infant care. Clayton crafted a proper cradle from pine, sanding it until the wood was satin smooth beneath his calloused hands. He built a rocking chair for the corner of their bedroom, presenting it to Beatrice with shy pride. For when you're nursing the baby, he explained. In October, a letter arrived from California. Clayton's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, Beatrice watching anxiously from across the kitchen table. His face, so expressive to her now after months of learning its every nuance, registered shock, then joy. They're coming, he said, looking up from the letter. Caleb, Rebecca, and the children, they're coming for Christmas. The news added a new dimension to their preparations. Beyond readying for the baby, they now had to prepare for houseguests' family reuniting after years of separation. Clayton threw himself into repairs he had been postponing, ensuring the second bedroom was properly weatherproofed and furnished for his brother's family. Beatrice, despite her increasing discomfort as her pregnancy advanced, took charge of making the house as welcoming as possible. She sewed new curtains for the guest room, repaired linens, and planned elaborate meals for the holiday season. They won't care about curtains, Clayton pointed out one evening as she stitched by lamplight. They're coming to see us, not the house. I care, Beatrice replied, not looking up from her work. I want them to see that you've built a good life here, that we have. Clayton moved behind her chair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. They'll see that the moment they meet you, he said softly. November arrived with an early snow and increasing anticipation. The baby was due any day, according to the doctor's calculations. Clayton rarely strayed far from the house, arranging his work so he could check on Beatrice frequently throughout the day. You don't need to hover, she told him after finding him watching her from the doorway for the third time in a morning. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my baby, Clayton replied simply. Not my wife. The labor began on a clear, cold morning in mid-November. Beatrice was hanging fresh dish towels when the first pain gripped her, sharp and insistent. She gripped the back of a chair, breathing through it as Mrs. Abernathy had instructed her to do. When it passed, she moved to the door and called for Clayton, who was splitting wood in the yard. He came running at the sound of her voice, axe abandoned in the snow. It's time, she told him, managing a smile despite the fluttering of nerves in her stomach. Can you fetch Mrs. Peterson? The seamstress also served as the town's midwife, having delivered most of the children in the county over the past 20 years. Clayton had already arranged for her to stay in town as Beatrice's time approached, so she could be fetched quickly when needed. I'll be back as soon as I can, Clayton promised, already moving toward the barn where his fastest horse was stabled. He paused, returning to press a fervent kiss to Beatrice's lips. I love you, he whispered, both of you. The hours that followed tested Beatrice's strength and courage as nothing in her life had before. The pain came in waves, building in intensity as the day progressed. Mrs. Peterson arrived with her bag of supplies and years of practical experience, calmly directing Clayton to heat water and prepare clean linens before shooing him from the bedroom. Men are no use at times like these, she declared, helping Beatrice change into a clean nightgown. They just pace and worry and get underfoot. Beatrice might have laughed if another contraction hadn't seized her at that moment. He means well, she gasped when it had passed. They all do, dear, Mrs. Peterson said, patting her hand. Now let's see how things are progressing. Outside the bedroom door, Clayton did indeed pace. Each cry from within tore at his heart, leaving him feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. He prayed with an intensity that surprised him, bargaining with God for the safety of his wife and child. As afternoon faded into evening, the cries from the bedroom grew more frequent and intense. Clayton pressed his forehead against the wall beside the door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Mr. West. Mrs. Peterson's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, her apron stained but her expression calm. Your wife is asking for you. Clayton entered the bedroom hesitantly. Beatrice lay on the bed, her hair dark with sweat against the pillow, her face flushed with effort. She reached for his hand, and he took it, marveling at the strength in her grip as another contraction took hold. You're doing wonderfully, Mrs. Peterson assured her. The baby's head is crowning, just a few more good pushes. Clayton held Beatrice's hand, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and murmured encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. The minutes stretched into an eternity of effort and pain, hope and fear intertwined. And then, suddenly, a new sound filled the room, the indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. A boy, Mrs. Peterson announced, lifting the squalling infant for them to see. A fine, healthy boy, Clayton stared in wonder at the tiny, red-faced creature that was his son. Tears blurred his vision as Mrs. Peterson cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a soft blanket, and placed him in Beatrice's waiting arms. Hello, little one, Beatrice whispered, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she gazed at their child. We've been waiting for you. Clayton sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Beatrice's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's head with its dusting of dark hair. He's perfect, he said, his voice rough with emotion. What will you call him, Mrs. Peterson asked as she efficiently changed the bed linens around Beatrice. Beatrice looked up at Clayton. They had discussed names but hadn't made a final decision. What do you think? Clayton studied the tiny face, already showing signs of the strong features that would develop in time. How about William? He suggested. After your father, fresh tears welled in Beatrice's eyes. William Clayton West, she said, testing the name. It's perfect. Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. A good, strong name for a good, strong boy. She gathered her supplies. I'll sleep in the spare room tonight, just to be sure everything continues well. You should rest now, Mrs. West. The real work of motherhood is just beginning. After the midwife had left, Clayton stretched out carefully beside Beatrice on the bed, his arm protectively encircling her and their son. Thank you, he whispered against her temple, for coming into my life, for our son, for everything. Beatrice turned her face to his, her eyes luminous with happiness despite her exhaustion. Who would have thought, she murmured, that those desperate words I'll work for food would lead to this? Clayton kissed her gently. The best bargain I ever made, he said. Though I'm not sure who got the better deal, you got food and shelter, but I got a lifetime of happiness. We both did, Beatrice corrected, looking down at their sleeping son. We both did. In the weeks that followed William's birth, the West household settled into a new rhythm centered around the needs of its smallest member. Clayton proved to be a devoted father, willingly taking his turn walking the floor with the fussy infant in the middle of the night so Beatrice could rest. "You need your sleep more than I do," he insisted when she protested. "I can nap during the day if needed." As December arrived, preparations for Caleb's visit intensified. The guest room was ready, additional supplies were laid in, and Beatrice, gradually regaining her strength, began planning the Christmas feast. "Do you think they'll like me?" she asked Clayton one evening as they sat by the fire, William sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them. Clayton looked up from the toy horse he was whittling for his nephew. "They'll love you," he assured her. How could they not? The day of Caleb's arrival brought a fresh snowfall that blanketed the ranch in pristine white. Clayton had ridden to town to meet the stagecoach, leaving Beatrice to make final preparations at the house. She had just finished nursing William when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Moving to the window, she saw Clayton driving the wagon up the lane, a man seated beside him who could only be his brother. The family resemblance was striking, even from a distance. Behind them, a smaller figure, presumably Caleb's wife, held what appeared to be a child bundled against the cold. Beatrice smoothed her dress, checked that William was presentable in the new outfit she had sewn for the occasion, and went to the door to greet her in-laws. The reunion between the brothers had clearly been emotional. Both men had reddened eyes and spoke with a gruff affection that suggested barriers had been broken on the ride from town. Caleb's wife, Rebecca, was a petite woman with kind eyes and a ready smile who embraced Beatrice as if they were already old friends. "So this is our nephew," Caleb said, bending to look at William, who was awake and studying the newcomers with solemn interest. "He has the West chin, that's certain. And his mother's eyes," Clayton added proudly. The children's 7-year-old James and 5-year-old Sarah were initially shy, hiding behind their mother's skirts. But the promise of cookies and the novelty of a new baby cousin soon overcame their reserve. That evening, as the two families gathered around the dinner table, Beatrice looked around at the faces illuminated by lamplight Clayton, his expression more relaxed and happy than she had ever seen it. Caleb and Rebecca, clearly content in each other's company. The children, excited by the adventure of travel and the promise of Christmas. And William, sleeping peacefully in the cradle they had placed near the table so he could be part of the gathering. This was what Clayton had meant when he spoke of building something that would last. Not just the ranch with its houses and barns and livestock, but this family, connection, love passing from one generation to the next. Later, after the children were asleep and Rebecca had gone to bed, the brothers sat talking by the fire, their voices a low murmur as they bridged the years of separation. Beatrice, tending to William in the rocking chair nearby, felt a profound sense of rightness, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the sun glinting off the snow-covered landscape. The house filled with delicious smells as Beatrice and Rebecca prepared the feast: roast goose, potatoes, fresh bread, and pies made from preserves put up during the summer. The children's excitement was infectious as they opened the simple gifts that had been placed under the small pine tree Clayton had cut and brought inside. Wooden toys carved by both brothers, cloth dolls sewn by Beatrice and Rebecca, books and sweets purchased in town. For Beatrice, Clayton had a special gift: a locket containing a tiny lock of William's hair on one side and a small photograph of Clayton on the other, taken during their trip to town for supplies weeks earlier. "So we're always close to your heart," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Beatrice touched it reverently. "It's perfect," she whispered, blinking back tears. Her gift to him was more practical but no less meaningful: a new ledger book for the ranch, its leather cover tooled with the West Creek brand, and the flyleaf inscribed with a quote from Tennyson that had become meaningful to them both. "And all is well, though faith and form be sundered in the night of fear." As they gathered around the table for Christmas dinner, Caleb raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said, his gaze moving from his wife to his children to his brother and sister-in-law. to bridges rebuilt and new beginnings. To family, they all echoed, even the children with their cups of cider. Beatrice caught Clayton's eye across the table and saw in his expression everything she was feeling: gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment, joy in the family they were building, and hope for the future stretching before them. Later that night, with the house quiet and their guests asleep, Beatrice and Clayton stood on the porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. William was bundled warmly against his father's chest, sleeping peacefully despite the cold. "Happy?" Clayton asked, his arm around Beatrice's waist. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "You, more than I ever thought possible." He kissed the top of her head. "When you walked up to my fence that day, I had no idea you were bringing my whole future with you." Beatrice smiled, remembering her desperation, her hunger, her uncertainty. "I'll work for food," she had whispered, and he had offered her so much more: a home, a family, a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning into something strong and enduring. "I'm glad I stopped at your ranch," she said simply. "So am I," Clayton replied, his arm tightening around her. "So am I." Together they stood in the crisp night air, the three of them, husband, wife, and child, silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the windows of their home. Behind them, the past with all its hardships and wrong turns. Before them, a future bright with promise. And in this moment, the perfect peace of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. 5 years later, the West Creek Ranch had flourished beyond Clayton's most ambitious dreams. The main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. William had been joined by 3-year-old Elizabeth and 1-year-old James. The land holdings had increased, with Clayton purchasing an adjacent property when the elderly owner decided to move east to live with his daughter. Beatrice had established a small school in one of the outbuildings, teaching not only her own children, but those of neighboring ranchers who would otherwise have had to board in town for their education. Her reputation as a skilled teacher spread throughout the county, bringing families from as far as 20 miles away for the twice-weekly lessons. Clayton had been elected to the town council, his fair-minded approach to problems and steady character earning him the respect of even the most contentious members of the community. Together, he and Beatrice had become fixtures in Pine Creek society, hosting gatherings at the ranch and contributing generously to community projects. On the anniversary of the day they met, Clayton and Beatrice always took time for themselves, usually a picnic by the creek that gave the ranch its name. It had become a tradition, a way to honor the unlikely beginning of their life together. "Do you ever regret it?" Clayton asked as they sat beneath a cottonwood tree, watching William and Elizabeth play at the water's edge while baby James napped on a blanket beside them. Saying yes to a stranger's bizarre proposal, Beatrice smiled, the years having added character to her beauty rather than diminishing it. "Not for a moment," she assured him, taking his hand. "Though I will admit, there were times in those first few weeks when I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake." Clayton laughed, the sound mingling with the babbling of the creek and the children's laughter. "Fair enough. I had those moments too. But look what we've built," Beatrice said, gesturing to encompass not just their children but the prosperous ranch beyond. "From desperation and impulsiveness came all of this." Clayton lifted her hand to his lips, "and I wouldn't change a single day of it." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, the West family made their way back to the house that had become the heart of their world. William ran ahead, his dark hair catching the golden light, while Clayton carried a sleepy Elizabeth and Beatrice cradled James against her shoulder. The lamp in the kitchen window glowed with welcome, a beacon guiding them home. Inside, the table was set for supper, the rooms tidy and comfortable, a far cry from the bachelor's quarters Beatrice had first encountered. Later, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Beatrice and Clayton sat on the porch, a ritual they had maintained through all the seasons of their marriage. "Mrs. Abernathy asked me today if we were planning on more children," Beatrice mentioned, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Clayton raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell her?" "That some questions were best left between husband and wife." Beatrice's smile broadened. but I might have hinted that our family doesn't feel quite complete yet. Clayton took her hand, his expression serious but his eyes warm with love. Are you sure? 3 little ones already keep you busy from dawn till dusk. I'm sure, Beatrice replied. This life we've made it's fuller and richer than anything I could have imagined when I was teaching in Philadelphia. Each child has brought new joy. She leaned against his shoulder. Besides, I rather enjoy the process of creating them. Clayton laughed, pulling her closer. Mrs. West, you still managed to surprise me even after all these years. Good, Beatrice said, turning her face up for his kiss. A little surprise keeps life interesting. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, the sounds of their ranch settling around them, both were thinking of that fateful day when a desperate young woman had whispered, "I'll work for food," and a lonely rancher had countered with an offer that changed both their lives immeasurably for the better. Some might call it luck, others providence. But Beatrice and Clayton West knew it for what it truly was, the beginning of a love story that would continue to unfold across the seasons and years of their shared life on the Wyoming frontier.